Boy Meets Girl. It's the critics' coined summary of classic romance stories with a long lineage of who said what first and countless continuations of the plot beat. There's something characteristic about the proverbial Boy Meets Girl story. It's a classic, a JP favorite, and one of the most consistent motifs of the Wii games I've played. Xenoblade, The Last Story, Fragile Dreams, and now Pandora's Tower all push for this plot beat. It's a common trend for Japanese artists to take Western influences and run with them, and the cinematic approach to this classic idea is obvious, but has its twist in surrounding elements or with their own unique approach. To provide context, the two most common sentiments are boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy wins girl, or boy meets girl, tear them apart, and together for finish. And while I'm clueless about Pandora's Tower's story in full, I have the privilege of experiencing the other three stories, and they each follow it in an interesting but distinct manner. The last story is an extremely traditional but effective one, with one of the most authentic love stories on the console, if not in gaming. It's sweet, innocent, and charming. Xenoblade Defo puts it on the back burner in favor of the grander world-ending plot and uses it primarily to flesh out characters and further develop their respective arcs. I could even make an argument that The Legend of Zelda, specifically Twilight Princess, applies a similar beat with Link and Midna's plot, but with a twist, or that Link and Zelda, depending on the game, also follow this storytelling motif. But my most recent and complete experience was with Fragile Dreams, or in JP and put short, Fragile, and their lovely duo. Twilight Princess had a twist in its bittersweet end, and its arrival at Link's lowest low without losing his companion, but instead so much else. Reference the graph for visuals, and stretch the middle point and deepen the dip into despair if you want to visualize the mood of TP. That abrupt tangent is to identify how a classic story can retain identity, but achieve novelty with its divergences. Fragile characteristically starts at a low point, and despite cheesy good endings, still manages to surprise with a thematically melancholic low for its final close of the curtains. And that's all to say this motif is persistent in the Wii JRPGs I've been grinding. It was sort of expected with the Rainfall trilogy, but despite a year or two at most in release differences, and being an independent release before Rainfall, Fragile very much felt in that lineage, as an odd proprietor to it all. I could be looking into it all a bit too much, but JRPGs pushing the boundaries of the Wii's graphics, overflowing with style, and pushing modern conventions of play and plot are cool as hell and defo an era to its own within this pocket of the 7th generation consoles. So before I start musing about the etymologies of the Wii and storytelling in general, I'll tie the knot on this essay. Fragile Dreams, or Fragile, is a survival horror Wii game that had no right to be as experimental and successful as it was. Reviews of a bygone age be damned, play ain't everything, nor was Fragile's as bad as in their memory. And no doubt the game suffered from the tried and true game time equals value equation of the industry. Fragile is a short, emotional, and beautiful survival horror through the apocalypse with the Wiimote flashlight gimmick in hand. It's hardly a perfect game, with plenty of flaws and annoyances, but it's an astounding adventure, abundant with style and substance in equal and awesome measure. I'd like to give it that credit, to remember and honor its art. However, we'll start with what was most criticized, and admittedly to a point of annoyance. The sum of the systems isn't negative. I'd argue it's a compromise to facilitate interactivity over combative depth. In all honesty, it's apparent that gameplay wasn't the primary focus of the game. Others and I label the game as a survival horror, and it's a fair assessment, but I've also my qualms with it. 1. When it comes to controls, there's a contrast between an immersive and unique sense behind play and the agitating problems behind control complications ripping the player out of the moment. Plenty of survival horrors harbor the classic and frustrating tank controls literally or metaphorically. 2. The horror aspect is present and serves as a proper facilitator for conflict through frustrating combat and an eerie tension built upon fear and paranoia. 3. There's a lot of exploration, item hunting, and/or collecting, and inventory management. The game pushes for searching every nook and cranny, not just for plot progression, but also for player progression via inventory expansion and acquisition. 4, the last element to come to mind, is an odd one, but the save function being spread throughout like checkpoints, but without proper checkpoints or autosaves, feels very survival horror-esque, in a manner I, as a not-so-dedicated SH fan, can't describe. So all in all, I think the assessment is fair, but like any genre, titling is more one-word or few-word summary and serves little beyond that function. The inspiration for gameplay is obviously inspired by famous titles, belonging to the lineage of SH games, but still feels unfocused. The best feeling I have is that the gameplay and survival horror elements were tacked on last because they most fit the shape of the story and style that had already been outlined. It makes me think of that one internet meme surrounding the girl reacting to some peep throwing every shape into the same hole on a puzzle, because, like, ain't that an analogy for how that genre and its qualities work with this game, but not in any way I feel is most correct. And that's probably just semantics talking, sorry, it just doesn't mimic the intentionality and design present everywhere else in Fragile, which is disappointing. The why behind those 4 points deserves some attention as well. I have thoughts, I must scream, simple as. The game has stiff controls built upon the Wii's sensor bar and limited control options, forcing available options to operate with whatever's present, leaving little room for customization or alternative control schemes. In the absence of technical annoyances, it reinforces the novelty of exploring the world firsthand, with direction directed by point of perspective. However, there's still something to say about the sensor bar glitching out, which did happen, and the skill component surrounding not disconnecting the Wii nunchuck during play, abruptly killing the immersion the gameplay hinges so desperately on. Like, I had to get up and change batteries during session 1 just to discover I had no AA's, so I scrapped the footage, deleted my save, and tried again the next day. I swapped Wiimotes at the start and several nunchucks because, surprise surprise, some of the ports and jacks of my controllers are loose after years. Wait, it's been over a decade. That's kind of wild. Anyway, too much use has worn these puppies out. And is that a Wii complaint or a Fragile complaint? I'm not sure, but regardless, it did occur during mid-play, and it did hurt play. The main novelty of play is also in the controls because exploration is incredible and tangent with the perfect atmosphere the game provides. Fragile's controls touch exploration in 3 simple ways: point, interact, and move. It handles using the sensor bar and pointer, the joystick, and the A button. There's even a button, B I believe, to first-person look around, and it's a solid addition, even if it's a bit needless. Running around searching for collectibles, items, environmental storytelling moments, and plot progressors is a joy, partly for style, but for now because the novelty isn't interesting, but is also fun. Interactivity and immersion working in tangent with controls to force the player to really look around, and a method comparative to VR before the tech ever blew up just fucks good. Furthermore, the incentive to explore is worthwhile. The attention to detail in environments is impressive, if not downright outstanding. Little details add up, and the collectibles feature stories both interesting and relevant to world building. I'll highlight the special flashlight that illuminated the world in a shade of green, but also revealed hidden messages left behind by spirits. I was lost and clueless searching for some MacGuffin and decided maybe it's all the way back at the start of the game, and stumbled upon some extra hidden monologues written out on walls from a character whose story had already been concluded for hours. Unnecessary but appreciated attention to detail, and a fine example of why this world can be so engaging. Still, there's an antagonist to this beyond the controls. Honestly, controls aren't the biggest issue, almost at all in Fragile, during exploration that is. Where the cracks form and erupt is in combat. Enemies for the most part are slow, and while invisible, they can be revealed by illumination via flashlight. But sometimes enemies are quick, and Seto, the player, is slow, so the Wiimote sensor bar interaction can quickly ignore movements and reactions, or bug out simply. It's hard to react to the smaller, swifter, and shittier enemies precisely and quickly. It's also overly simply relying on the metaphorical tank controls, creating difficulty in the absence of a real challenge. Timing, well, kind of, reaction speed, and careful thought aren't major factors. Instead, measuring range, stun lock capability, and weighing weapon versus light values takes priority. I'm personally aware I have a depth perception problem. Doesn't stop me from being a crack shot. But it does make me wonder if it's the game or my eyes creating a difficulty in measuring distance and hit/hurt boxes. It's just not as clear as other action-oriented games. I'll also note that Pro and Antagonist suffer from stun locking. So long as Seto's attacks connect, and timing and landed combos can be easily executed and stun single targets, while enemies rely on teaming up to perma-stun Seto to death. It's rare, but groups of enemies can 100-0 the player while Seto is still in hurt frames. And it sucks due to the lack of a real checkpoint system. Tedium's lame, simple as. The worst contender, however, is the brightness. Of all the things, it had to be visibility that damned the combat. Certain weapons are preferred or borderline mandatory for specific enemies, and some of those weapons are two-handed, meaning no flashlight. The issue lies with the game's brightness, and ask me to turn my TV's brightness to 25 out of 100, far from its resting 50 out of 100 I prefer. Flying enemies in a dark environment demanding bow or crossbow can suck it. This design flaw was by far the most unfair and unfun for me. It isn't all bad, despite my many complaints. Between tedious combat and a few too frequent requests for backtracking, the game offers some fun mechanical moments. The many different weapons and types are fun to play with, and each have a timing to familiarize with to optimize play. Light weapons have their combos, longer weapons can be fun to measure when the perspective isn't off, and heavy weapons have their weight and power attacks, while ranged weapons can break the game given proper lighting to abuse. It's fun to play with and mess around with, and the animations were fun to see, as well as feel with proper feedback for finishing combos and hitting hard. The bosses, save one mole beaten by range in a safe spot, are easy but fun. The tree was easy enough to face check, but was visually neat. The mole was frustrating till cheesed. The final boss was epic in every way but mechanically. And the crane is as humorous as it is humongous. They've all got an enjoyable aspect, even if mechanical challenge isn't their strong suit. In some, it had its pitfalls, but remained entertaining and novel throughout. The oddities, flaws, and lack of focus in some places never stole away from the true conflict. Were combat the only method of conflict, it would have been abrasive to a painful degree, but tension built upon paranoia managed to support and even carry the foundations built by combat. The tension created through ghastly enemies, audio cues, and a consistent sense of dread surrounding paranoia from where the next encounter may come from and what it'll be. Fear of lost progress is fear all the same. And the last thing I need to, want to, or must note is EXP. The game's a genuine JRPG, levels and all included, so there are some familiar topics to touch on. Choice encounters can be repeated and therefore are opportunities for grinding. Levels grant two things, HP or ATK, or attack, and that means level-based progression features a simple duality of offensive and defensive growth. It's a system investment to provide accessibility and thankfully does not demand it. Early on, I killed everything in sight, and by the time enemies were being repeated but different, with new colors, I started skipping almost all encounters, and was still appropriately leveled for the end. Honestly, it was one of the first times in a while I wasn't obviously underleveled in an RPG, so much for my consistent underleveled and underdog conceit. I also wanted to highlight the system because it demands very little interaction and still gives accessibility of grinding to overcome challenges for players that need it. So aside from some pestering pieces, the overall game experience is fairly tight. There's a focus on interactivity and immersion through exploration, and the fear factor is present enough in tandem with isolation to provide a stellar atmosphere. I'll conclude that tension via isolation and paranoia would have been better foci for a means of narrative conflict than the tried and true combat inclusion. They were already present and could have been reinforced by removing combat and using its resources elsewhere. But overall, it didn't stunt my playtime or cause me to drop the game. It was functional in play and didn't hurt the overall experience, and its focus on style and story managed to shine through anyway. Speaking of style, holy fuck. The initial first and immediate hook of Fragile is visual. The visual style, and more specifically color choices, grabbed me instantly upon witnessing the wonderful game cover. First impressions aren't the whole of any media, but they're a good measure of taste. Plenty of books sold me on the cover and proved their worth with each and every page, but I also have a history of reading and knew what to look for. The same mostly exists for games, although a bloated library stifles that urge to buy upon first impressions alone. Regardless, I know enough about games and have spent plenty an hour pursuing shelves with a gift card in hand looking for something new and exciting that lasts me till next birthday and or holiday to recognize what catches my eye and can hold that attention with just a glance. Suffice to say, Fragile had that effect and would have been completed much sooner should I ever have seen it in stores as a kid or not been occupied away from my consoles this past half a year. That's just a long-winded answer to the game looked good at a glance, and past that in play, managed to uplift itself to being one of the best looking Wii games ever to grace my library. I mean, fuck it, I put it up there with Xenoblade, The Last Story, Twilight Princess minus the bloom, and other graphically and stylistically wonderful games on Wii. There's just an epic sense to it, partly because it cares so desperately about scale while being set in Tokyo of all things, and manages to be as pretty as it is impressive. I guess I should just jump right in, because there's no proper way to convey what's on screen and context of the events and atmosphere the game collectively strives to obtain. It's a working machine of parts, but takes more than just the music and visuals to craft its melancholic movie shots. So, on to color, I guess. Ignore the pun, I miss hue, but collectively it captures themes and styles in a phrase. The visuals of Fragile are impressive, the cinematic shots are honestly up to snuff with some games today, and it's been over a decade, like damn. Graphically and focusing on lighting, the game does some cool shit. It does ask, not demand, for the player to dim their TV to sadly ridiculous levels of darkness, and it's hard to convey on my screen or an editor just how dark the game looked on screen, but I try. So while that's a big oof in the play department, it manages to still look amazing even when most of the screen is just black and void to the player. It does have an effect of magnifying light as a thematic element as much as an attractive one. Fireflies are used as markers, and I think also the crosshair, for the pointer at least, in the same helpful natural hue. In the presence of the dark void, it actually helps play up the dark, cool blue sky, decorated with many hues of blue, speckles of light in the form of stars, and the all-too-important style of the moon we wish to share with others. While the stark warm reds paint the dawn, the flames of the campfire, and magnify the sense of a new day. Perhaps a creative idea of tying that feeling into red levels, portraying how an ending is in truth just another beginning. Beyond the credits, the black screen, and the still no longer screeching Wii U is another story that we'll never see, but all the same acknowledge. And note, there is a post-credits story that does exist in manga form, translated too, thankfully to the credit of the scanners and such on screen. And even after that conclusion, we know the world and stories march on without us. Don't mind me just rambling about color theming, one of my favorite growing passions. And blue has this sense of danger, darkness, endings, and conclusions. Bright, unnatural blues are given to enemies to signify danger, and there's a connection present between blue and death. It's all very clever, symbolic, and attractive. But the contrast between one day and one night blending together in the sky fucks pretty good. Pairing the warm red and cool blue in a beautiful scene is damn magnificent, especially in how the blend is conceptually contrasting, but natural in look and nature. And of course, there were the moments of yellow sunlight bleeding through the treetops and a well-masked loading screen segment. It's followed by more than just a yellow sun and lighting, but almost looks like the lighting is being used also as a literal filter, applying the summer sun yellow to everything illuminated by its gaze. Fragile's just consistent with its usage of lighting and color and cohesion to tell stories visually and also to simply awe with their beauty. And I'm no expert, but graphically this is comparable to the later Wii titles like The Last Story, which pushed the console to literally its limits and forced serious frame drops because of it. Yet Fragile manages to maintain its look and performance with very rare and quick moments of stutter, probably in the form of its masked loading screens. Not to say it doesn't have loading screens, but it does hide a few throughout winding passages and long hallways. Which is a solid segue to highlight the level design and its overall strengths alongside a few poignant problems. To start with the bad, if only to get it out of the way, what the fuck is the sewer segment and why? There's like 7 or 8 areas and all but one made it into the plot chapter. Can you guess which fucking one? I think the sewer segment is probably labeled as the tunnels, but it's a mess and the lowest point in the game. Basically, it's where the designer's pursuit of scale feels less like an artistic decision and more like game padding, because up till this point, it never felt like an annoyance or ever this obvious. The game's big, the sense of scale is immersive and impressive at all points, but one winding, blundering section. There's one stupidly long tunnel, and like the maintenance tunnel part of the mall was a story-filled and intricately made portion meant to be traversed several times and produce strong memories, while the tunnels were a transitionary segment from the early mid-game to the late, and featured a significant pause in plot, character development, and honestly fun. I don't mind rusted metal ruins, but it was overplayed and honestly done both before and after better. The ruined malls portray ruined human society wonderfully, and the dam's interior handles the metallic mortality of man's innovation in a dark, damp, and dreadful way much better, while the sewers exemplify scale without substance, and makes the mid-game feel like nothing more than padding. Literally everything apart from the main plot features characters and their individual arcs as to make these tangents meaningful and memorable, whereas the sewers feel like actual padding because it starts nothing, therefore adding nothing to the writing. Made worse because it's undermined before and after in design by better and similar levels. Maybe I'm just not contributing to the sense of realism and scale enough, but for me personally, this part ripped me entirely out of the experience and paused my adventure just to start a slog for a few hours until I returned to what felt like Fragile, and not whatever the fuck that was. Luckily, that's the worst part, and everything before and after retains the quality one expects from a title this fucking cool looking. Just sad that that had to exist at all. I mentioned the mall and dam putting the decay of human civilization on display and fulfilling a creepy aesthetic without pause. They're both powerful environments because of the characters, plot events, and creative level design entered around environmental obstacles and challenges. The dam, for example, had some rickety walkways that could have been annoying, but felt purposeful and engaging the player, reminding them this isn't a well-maintained structure, but one of decay, all while still pushing the main plot. Environmental reminders of ruination are cool when adjacent to the plot. Honestly, the sewers had some areas like this, but overall felt untouched by the decay. Probably because tunnels like that feel indestructible even when unmaintained in modern society today. But I digress. I just really fucking hate those tunnels. The mall, specifically in tandem with the following two areas, the amusement park and the hotel, work together in a very Metroidvania-like manner. There's a ton of backtracking that hardly feels needless, minus one hard-to-find star. The moon and ring, however, weren't bad at all to find. Essentially, each depicts a broken-down world, once dominated by man, and with progression, reference each other several times for further exploration or even secrets as more segments unlock. It even doesn't feel backtracky because new pathways provide intuitive shortcuts that manage to appear natural. Like, the scale and the player protag work together to highlight how little we know about these structures and how over time we're getting better at maneuvering them. And each of these levels feature their own characters and arcs that add to the story in little ways, while also providing collectibles to share short stories with little moments of world building hidden in them. In hindsight, I was distracted from the plot continuously, but was able to enjoy what was present because of its quality and hints of the main plot. The sense of urgency is still present to find the living girl, but there was also a sense of urgency to help these ghosts, building friendships and new memories, and having them help us on our journey. It's actually paced really fucking well for how off the rails it can be. But I'll highlight the characters and their arcs later in more spoilery chapters. One thing I can highlight that was just mentioned is the side story collectibles. Introduced very early is the concept that some mystery items Seto picks up can be collectibles or useful utilities. The items are revealed at the campfire, and if it's a collectible, it's followed by a short story with a voiceover. In fact, from what I've read online, these were added in late as popularity for Fragile grew. These stories were worked into the game and given purpose with their consistent themes and references to world building. It's an optional exploration objective that adds to the stories of each environment and the overall game's pursuits. Speaking of voiceovers and actors, and just audio in general, yeah, the game's entirely voiced, which is mad impressive. It's all fairly well done too, and the English copy allows for JP voices should the player desire them. But like I said, the English VA is pretty solid. The game's also pretty heavy on audio, specifically cues. Before an enemy can be seen or even revealed by light, a unique audio cue plays for each enemy. For full immersion, I had them playing through the Wiimote so they wouldn't show up on my footage, which is a shame because they were horribly compressed to do so, and I found it interesting. Something about awful compressions scream humor as much as horror, and in the moment they can be tense, and in retrospect the thought just makes me laugh. There's also some Wiimote audio puzzles, or the odd hold it like a phone for some dialogue crap, but it stopped working well once I got to the sewer levels. Granted, that could be because of no more dialogue, bugs, or just not handling the Wiimote perfectly because the controller can just be angsty. Regardless, it's a neat gimmick that holds some novelty and made the experience impossible to understand from footage, but was cool as fuck to play regardless. And as for music, I'm no expert. I do my research, I give it an independent listen, I note instrumentation, and give it my all despite no formal or even informal background. And Fragile's OST is kinda wild to me. It's very simple yet effective. The instrumentation is a bit limited, and that's mostly for consistency, because there's an intentional limit to the clutter in each song. And what I mean is each track only features a few, like 3, sometimes even less, rarely more, instruments, and that's kind of the point. The limited instrumentation allows for focus on the melodies, and creates a feeling akin to isolation in the music, which is smart IMO. And overall, it manages to be somber and melancholic with lasting notes, staggered instrumentation, gradual build-ups, and so fucking much sad piano, and just generally slower tracks. There are exceptions, like the combat music, or Malice as it's called, with its more evil and faster build-up. As the track and presumably combat continue on, it grows in volume and intensity to signify the struggle of longer combats, with bosses, larger groups, and tougher foes, drawn out chases from evading foes. It's incredibly effective and natural musical storytelling. But overall, it features pretty simple, slow songs with piano, flutes, and violins working together to add to the atmosphere. And I found it mad memorable because of the consistent musical motifs and its sheer emotional quality. And I have more notes on several songs because I sampled each song on the OST and wrote notes as I went along. It should be obvious why I didn't add those in some to this section. I'm no expert, again, but I'm just trying to give credit where it's due as someone who struggles to do so with integrity. Music's hard, but cool as fuck. That's my point. Fragile Dreams OST is emotionally impactful and beautiful due to its simple but powerful tracks. The mood is consistently amplified both somberly and isolation-y by the music and adds greatly to the game's effect. It's an OST I'll gladly revisit while working because of how provocative it can be. Which then brings us to the last point of style, the characters, the cast, and the cats. There's plenty of odd, quirky, downright weirder than weird characters here. The merchant with the chicken head and eerie red demon eyes and his screaming, jovial voice come to mind. They're expertly portrayed, and it has the effect of adding to the novelty by putting the creator's character on display throughout their interactions. I mean, look at these little guys and gals. There's a lot of detail even in the concept art, and they're more than pretty for it. Each have their own unique color scheme, clothing, accessories everywhere, and expressive faces necessary for such an emotional game. I fucking love them. They're fun to watch as they bring much needed life and charm into such an empty and lonely world. And their VAs do them some good justice. PF's literally a backpack computer, and even she has a lot of personality. If this was the Star Wars universe, you betcha they'd instantly ask to give her a memory wipe and take that sweet personality away. And it's just fucking sick because every character is like that. They're each layered and complicated and have their own goals, thoughts, and emotions. They're awesome companions and even distractions from the main quest. Each is covered in little details, and even the most throwaway one and done of them have visual depth and care obviously put into them. And to be fair, with a game focused on isolation as an element meant to reinforce the short time you have with each of them, you can't afford to have a big cast. And with a small cast, you can't afford for them to come off half-baked. I'm still limited on details because spoilers, but trust me, I love each and every one of them. They even gave Chicken Man a backstory, and it's fucking sad. And that's sick, but still sad. Anyway, last note before substance, story, and spoilers, cats. We gotta talk about cats. They're a plot device, and you know what? Fuck it, it's cool. You'll be stunted from progression, forced to have a campfire talk, and then boom, cat. Here to save the day and show the way. They just sit around, act cute, meow through my Wiimote, can't share that crunchy audio, sorry, and fill plot holes. It's fucking cool. There's cat toys, cat food, petting, playing, and just a whole lot of feline friends, and their glistening eyes in the dark. It's fucking cute, and I gotta give them credit where it's due. But yeah, spoiler time, I guess. That was the style segment, because damn, Fragile Dreams Farewell to Ruins of the Moon is stylish as hell. Story, spoilers, substance. Fragile is a game abundant with stories and themes, focused on saying meaningful shit as much as possible and unafraid to be as depressing and emotionally draining as it can be in its meager dozen hours or less runtime. It's honestly impressive how it uses isolation in this short time to deepen bonds with the characters more than what I thought possible in the time allotted. Usually JRPGs spend a good 20 or 50 hours building relationships before they ever get trudging on with the main plot, and Fragile takes the opposite approach to magnify their meaning to we, the audience. It starts in an observatory with a quick introduction to Controls and Seto, our young protagonist, who just lost their last living companion, their grandfather. This individual doesn't participate much in our story, but depicts us, society, the modern man. Seto's grandfather, even when surrounded by others, lacked connection to them, and even after the world ended and all he knew was a young boy, still could not connect with him. It's a message that grows over time, that one should not take their peers for granted. From there, Seto finds his flashlight, a blue crystal to perceive ghosts, weird but cool, whatever, and a note from his granddad telling him to seek others, and thanking him for dealing with an apathetic old man like him. Damn. Then we get an OVA depicting rad music and the passage of time and distance as Seto marches towards a red tower in the distance. It's an okay start, and has the cool function of bearing a little worm to grow with time in our head about we, the modern man, and our lesson to learn. From there, Seto finds a living girl and chases her into a mall. Man has no riz. Such a shame. From there, we're introduced into a decaying world in full. And while looking for the girl, we meet PF, the personal frame robot telling us just how in the future we are, and many tutorial bits and pieces along the way. It's honestly an okay start. There's a quick, short tutorial surrounding collectibles about a mother and daughter in the mall as it crumbled, and a segment to get a key from the ghastly girl in a storage hub outside the mall. Pretty vistas and some secrets should the player return later. This is a consistent conceit in the game, as with tangenting for thematic purpose over pursuing the primary plot. Once allowed, the player dives into the mall and with PF in tow, bonds together before escaping. Dialogue hints PF isn't that well off, and is revealed to have run out of juice, battery juice to be specific, before they finally escape. It's a significant scene because it portrays what little time they have together as powerful and memorable. Despite being a robot, despite the short time together, emotions brewed and memories were buried deep in mind. Followed by an honestly impressive and very spoilery transitional piece that's super poetic and melancholic with a much older Seto monologuing away. Still, the main plot is nowhere in sight. Joy. Escaping the ball, Seto meets the strange boy Crow in the amusement park, and they get into a bit of a tussle. It's revealed very campily through a book Seto finds, and Crow's word-for-word dialogue from said book that the poor lad just wants friends, and doesn't know how to make them without a little bullying. Plus, the boy kiss is funny as cute as hell, and there's some fun puzzles and environments throughout, so the section hardly feels unnecessary. Instead, it's additive to the journey, a memory Seto will keep long after the journey's end, and honestly a really fun tangent, one of the highlights of the game. Once the two part ways, however, Seto makes it into the hotel and meets the mysterious and defo not super important Sai, and then does fetch quests for several hours of the game for some random bratty ghost girl. It's a weak point, but not as bad as what I mentioned with the sewers or the tunnel level. There's a cool scene showing the lady was astral projecting her younger self while her body rested and rotted away in bed before age took her. But yeah, it was a neat tangent in line with the tangent conceit about additive memories along the journey, and had some fun puns with Sai calling her ghastly self a little girl acting like a stubborn old woman. Funny, a tad bit at least to my mind. Onwards from there, we get to the worst section of the game, oops, no plot, and finally then make it to the dam. Seto keeps exploring, aimlessly almost, and oh hey, who's that? It's the girl, oops, bye! And now we have our linear plot with a clear conflict and direction. Where's the girl? Taken. What's our mission? To kill everything between her and us. And at this point it sounds like Seto's role-playing Liam Neeson, but to be honest, it's a fun run through the concrete monument to man's innovation and possibly hubris? Plus, apparently there's a lab here, and Sai's our chosen consistent companion after leaving their respective area, and that means exposition dump time. Yeah, it's a bit weird, and I figured as much. Oops, the whole thing endangers the world time. Thanks, JP. Because the plot doesn't matter if we aren't saving the world or killing God. Whatever. Effectively, Sai in the past and soon the girl will be used to reenact the apocalypse. Initially, the device within the dam was used to try and help people empathize and communicate without words as a means to end conflict. Okay, high concept, but cool I guess. Except, it went horribly wrong and killed off most of the world. The girl is an artificial person made to emulate Sai and her uniqueness so that the project may be completed by a really pissed off doomer scientist. I mean, what did I expect? Oh, and he's a ghost, by the way. So yeah, one of the story conclusions of all time energy. There's some cool level design and a few novel-ish puzzles, but honestly, I was ready to see the end with all this goofiness amok. So, the girl in the lab and then Doomer runs off because we beat his ass with cheese, let's go crossbow, and then we chase him down to the Red Tower, and hey, I knew it'd come back. And then we mono him, and after some nostalgia, friendship, memories, or magic schlock, the exact same boss fight happens, and a shittier arena, and then Sai confesses her love to him, and he's no longer Doomer. 10 out of 10, too real, Doomer gets undoomed by pretty girl. What can you do? And then the story just ends with Seto and Ren introducing each other and agreeing to adventure the world together. And I did gloss over a few points about social anxiety, brought up exactly one time, and how Seto doesn't care if they don't get along, that he just wants to share the little things in life with others, even if they're a ghost. But because of the plot, they eventually leave too, so it's neat. Little things like sharing a pretty moon with someone is valuable. The entire story is older Seto reminiscing on the good times in life, which weren't because of what was happening, but because of who he was with, and, that fucks pretty hard. The overall message is pretty apparent in some. It's about people and memories, sharing our lives with others, good and bad, in order to have those memories long after they've passed and enjoy that they happen at all. The persistent measure of decay present creates an environment where life is so easily forgettable, and if no one remembers, the question arises, did we even exist at all? So it plays heavily into themes about connections, bonds, and remembering others. But if you thought it ended there, you're wrong. There's a manga that reinforces those themes by getting rid of the happy ending with a post-game story, illuminating some pretty sad shit. But despite it all, even the sad and difficult parts of life are worth living, so long as we keep each other company. That's the point, I think, and it's a damn relatable and important point to make. Honestly though, the game's deep as hell. It has a crazy amount going on with it. To encapsulate it in full, to spell out the themes, well, would be condescending to my audience and would be painfully long for me to make. I just wanted to share this cool, heartwarming, and depressing game that justifies our suffering through our communal existence. Our entire lives are quite fragile, and our history is the same, our lineage and legacy. Aside from our persistent and obvious needs of sleep, eat shit, and whatnot, there's an intrinsic drive for two grander things. One being the sexual desire, irrelevant, and two being the desire to feel important. To perhaps be remembered. Being important to others is a purpose, and the point, perhaps, of this little forgotten Wii game is to remember others, to remember each other. There's plenty more that could be said, and there's plenty of other YouTubers that can say it, probably better than me, or hell, the game itself can say it directly to you. But for now, I think that's all I can muster. I still have plenty more memories to make, with Fragile Dreams and with my peers. And I will admit, my conclusions are always abrupt and shit, and I'm sorry, but oh well. I hope y'all enjoy it, and to my peers, even those distanced from me in time and across land or sea, here are my thoughts, memories, and prayers. And take care, all of y'all.